Hello everyone, this is a review of the second episode of the Orville. I really enjoyed this episode, in some ways even more than the first episode. The special effects continue to be great. This time the episode had an opening showing the ship flying around, the near anomalies, which is kind of similar to the Voyager opening. By the way, the music in this show is not as good as Star Trek music, but it is pretty decent. The special effects continue to impress me, I think they're really good, and also a lot of new effects every episode. Some more similarities with Star Trek, they show that they have replicators this time, only they call them synthesizers. So once again changing names, but basically using the same exact idea. Also the transporter technology appears in this episode, but it doesn't belong to them, it belongs to a more superior species. Also, they use the tractor beam in this episode. So in short, a lot more similarities to Star Trek, which I think will give more ammunition to CBS if they ever decide to sue this show for a copyright violation. And it would be a very interesting legal battle, I think. And especially since they air at the same time, so in effect Orville might actually be stealing the same market that CBS's Star Trek is aiming for. And I think on a technical legal level, that will give more validity to CBS to actually complain about it in court, if it ever comes to that. So as I said previously, I do think this show captures the spirit of Star Trek as it should be, at least in some ways. In some ways it doesn't. And let me explain. I think visually it does fit exactly the kind of vision that Gene Roddenberry had, of a very bright future, a very optimistic future. Also, this episode actually dealt with some moral ethical topic, namely animal rights, using a metaphor with aliens, meaning they showed a superior alien species kidnapping members of the crew and putting them in a zoo, which is basically what we do to inferior animals. And so this episode basically kind of dealt with that ethical topic the same way as Star Trek would. Also, the old movie Planet of the Apes kind of did that, kind of showing people being treated as animals to kind of show us how it would feel for us if someone did that to us, what we do to animals. And so this episode kind of played with that same idea. And this is exactly what Star Trek is known for, kind of dealing with ethical topics like that. So all of this is great, but the characters themselves, they don't really feel like the enlightened humans that were in Star Trek. At least in TNG show, it always showed that the people themselves, humans themselves, are kind of more enlightened. Even if you take away all their high technology, they would still be more ethical people than today's people. At least in TNG. In later shows, they kind of dismissed that. By the way, I kind of like that in DS9, that they kind of showed that if you take away all that technology and put people in stressful situations, they would actually turn out to be basically like the people of today. DS9 did that really well in some episodes, especially the one about the war. They showed the like soldiers being stuck on a planet and basically forgetting all that morality, ethical stuff. So I kind of like DS9 for being darker and playing around with that idea to show that the future is not as perfect as we thought. Like humanity is still flawed, is still imperfect. So I kind of like that in the other Star Trek shows, but still the spirit, like the main aim of TNG was to show humanity being evolved. Like everybody are super nice to each other, in short. Like that was kind of the spirit of TNG. And yet in this show, all the people, all the characters are basically like people of today. And the episode even showed us that they all like to drink alcohol, they replicate drugs, and I'm not sure how I feel about that, because, you know, I grew up on Star Trek TNG, and I do think that it kind of made me a better person in a way, like especially like Captain Picard was a very moral figure, always giving good morality lessons and stuff. So I think that show was very kind of educational for kids, and many of the characters were like a very good role model. The show really gave like a good educational message. And in this show, if I look at all the characters, it's not really as educational for kids, in my opinion. And by the way, my favorite character in this show is probably Bortus. He's kind of like a mix between Worf and Teal'c from Stargate. He's that kind of character. He's kind of like the tough guy with no sense of humor, who is very good at his job, very professional. He always keeps a straight face in face of everything, so he's really a fun character in my opinion. Like, I love this type of characters. In many ways he reminds me much more of Teal'c than he does Worf actually, because Worf, at least in the beginning of TNG, was always very emotional. He was always very angry, like he jumped at every chance. And yet Teal'c was always very composed. Like Teal'c was more like a Vulcan. He was like a Klingon Vulcan. Like he didn't show his anger, he didn't show his aggression all the time like Worf did. And so Bortus here is really a lot more like Teal'c in that sense. And I really love his character, and I love the performance of this actor. the way he's able to say the most silly lines with a straight face, it really is funny in my opinion. So in this episode he shows up and says that he laid an egg and that he will soon have a child, and they casually mention that he has a male partner. So basically he's like a gay character, and basically their entire species is only males, and it's funny how in Star Trek we never ever saw any gay character, and yet here they do it so easily, so casually, and not forced. They did make Sulu gay in the new Star Trek movie, but that kind of felt forced in my opinion. There was one DS9 episode in which they showed Dax kind of in a gay relationship with another woman who was her ex-wife from a previous life. So they did kind of dealt with that topic. Also in TNG there was one episode about a genderless species, and yet they sometimes have a rare occasion of someone who has sexuality, and that species treats it as a perversion. And in the end of that episode there was a whole speech about it, which sounded a lot like a pro-gay rights speech. So that was the only occasion that that show actually kind of dealt with that topic. But anyway, since then a lot of shows, like a lot of modern shows, have gay characters without problems. Oftentimes it feels really forced. Like for example in the show Arrow and in the show Flash, both of those shows have gay characters in them, and they keep bringing it up that they're gay. Like they have to tell the audience, and it feels really forced, and I don't think that's the right way to do it. Like I have no problem against that, but I don't think it should be forced. And so anyway, in this show basically Bortus, I guess, is kind of like a gay character also, because he has a partner. Basically Bortus, I guess, is like a gay character, and yet no one is making a big deal out of it. Like the other characters, they did kind of make fun of him for laying an egg, but not for having a male partner. And by the way, it's kind of funny that if they all lay eggs, then wouldn't that make all of them females? Like wouldn't their whole species be classified as females? Like a chicken that lays eggs is a female, right? So how exactly does that work? Like maybe they all have penises and that's why they're all males? It really reminded me of a scene in Deep Space Nine with Dax talking to a Jem'Hadar and asking him how come they don't have any females.
There are no Jem'Hadar women.
So what do you do? Lay eggs?
So that kind of reminded me of that, and it was a really funny scene in Deep Space Nine, and so the same kind of humor is in this episode. So anyway, all the scenes with him were really funny, like he has to sit on his egg for 21 days, and Alara gets command of the ship and she kind of panics, not knowing what to do, and she comes to him and she just opens his door and comes in, and he says like in a straight face, I cannot leave my egg and all of that.
I am brooding my egg. It is a private time for a Mucklin.
His delivery is perfect. Like I really love his character, probably the funniest one so far in my opinion. Like I just love this guy. And speaking of Alara, she looked really strange in this episode and I couldn't figure out why. Like she looked different to how she looked in the first episode. So half the episode I was looking at her trying to figure out what the hell changed, until I looked at the picture of her from the previous episode and I noticed that she didn't have any eyebrows in the previous episode and her makeup was a little bit different, and I actually prefer the way she looked in the first episode. I think she looked much better with the first makeup. So I guess they decided to change it without explanation, so suddenly she has eyebrows, and it was really distracting in this episode because I couldn't figure out what changed. Like I knew something about her eyes looked different, but I couldn't figure out exactly. So apparently she has eyebrows now, and no explanation given. And you know, in Star Trek we often had those kind of changes. The first time we saw Bajorans, Ensign Ro, her nose ridges actually looked a bit different than later. Later on they kind of simplified it. And so here she didn't have eyebrows, suddenly she does have them. And I guess we can actually make up an explanation for it in universe, which would actually tie well with what we've seen of her character in this episode. We've seen that she cares a lot about what other people think about her, that she really wants the other people on the ship to like her. And so it's possible that maybe she actually did this change deliberately to kind of fit better with the rest of the crew, who are mostly human. Maybe on her planet it's actually the fashion to shave off the eyebrows, and since she's now serving on a ship with humans, maybe she decided to let them grow out to look more like the humans, to fit better. So I guess I can give this a break, but I really preferred how she looked in the first episode actually. She just looked cuter for some reason in the first episode. So I'm not sure how I feel about this change, but I guess it's okay. And some people might say, well, you're a hypocrite, you make such a big deal about the Klingons changing. Well, it's a little bit different because, again, this is the first time we actually see the species, and it's a really minor change. So it's kind of like what Star Trek did with the Bajorans, changed them a little bit in a very unnoticeable kind of way. With the Klingons, we have an established species that for decades looked a certain way. And the prequel show Enterprise even made special episodes to explain why they looked like humans in the original series, and so they already explained that. So the way that STD is kind of wiping that all away to basically reboot the Klingons completely to something else, that's really annoying. And the change is also not a small change, it's a very big change in their look. Suddenly they have no hair anymore, and the Klingons always had long hair and facial hair and all that stuff, so none of that anymore. Their head looks completely different, even their hands look very different, and so on. So it's a very major change. Basically they only kept the element of the ridges on the head, but they over-exaggerated everything else and basically turned them into completely different species. Now maybe they'll have a satisfactory explanation of it in the actual show, and if they do, maybe I'll forgive it a little bit, but if not, then it's total disrespect to the continuity of the whole franchise, in my opinion, and so that's why I don't think I will like the Klingons in STD, but I am curious to see what they will actually do with them, so I will definitely check out the new Star Trek when it comes, and it will be fun to compare it to the Orville, which so far I'm really enjoying. It could have been a very good sci-fi show even without the comedy, maybe even a better one without the comedy. And even Seth himself said in this episode, inside the episode, he said maybe I shouldn't try a comedy with you. So that line might actually fit the whole show. Like maybe the show would have been better off not as a comedy actually. Because the cast is great, the sets are great, the models are great. By the way, the model of the ship is an actual model, which they actually filmed. Maybe that's why it looks so good. So the special effects are great. Some of the ideas so far were great. I love the idea in this episode of them being taken by a more superior species and basically put in a zoo. It also raises the ethical topic of how we treat animals. So overall, a very good episode. I really enjoyed it. I do think this show has a lot of potential. I hope it keeps improving. I hope it keeps going. It will be very interesting to see it in competition with the actual Star Trek show. So anyway, that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you all next time.